Welcome to the series on Europe and the World, sponsored by the Jean Monnet Chair of European Security from the European Union. My name is Kaya Schilder. I'm the director of the Center for the Study of Europe. And as part of the series, we're delighted to welcome Linde Desmaele today to give a talk on Europe's role in US grand strategy, indispensable or insufferable. And I've been watching Dr. Desmaele's work for a while, and she and I travel in similar circles, but we just met for the first time last week at the airport on the way back from Montreal. We were just discussing that, so we had a conversation that was wonderful, and I look forward to sharing her work with all of you today. But briefly, let me give her bio and introduction. She's currently a Stanton Nuclear Security Fellow at MIT Security Studies Program. Her research is broadly on US-Europe relations, the evolution of US grand strategy, and its impact on transatlantic and European security. Also, she studies US regional deterrence strategies and alliance interdependence, as well as the role of leaders in IR theory. She has been published widely, I'm not going to list everywhere, but widely in security studies journals. She's also affiliated with the Free University of Brussels, and their Center for Security Diplomacy and Strategy. So I'm going to leave it at that to make it a shorter introduction to start hearing.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me, for having me, and for all of you for being here and for giving me the opportunity to present this particular research project, which is actually a book project that I'm working on. So I'm very excited to share some of my thoughts with you and also hear from you what you think, where you might have some questions or doubts or want to give some pushback. Very open to that, of course. And so the title of this book project is Europe's Role in US Grand Strategy, Indispensable or Insufferable, ? And the question that I'm interested in this project, it kind of goes back to, I was wondering what the so-called quote-unquote rise of the West, or this ongoing power shift away from the West, what that actually means for the US-Europe relationship. To put it very bluntly, in recent years, there's really this consensus, especially in the United States, that global politics are increasingly defined by what happens in Asia. And so that's got me to wondering then, well, what exactly is the purpose from the transatlantic relationship from the point of view of Washington in such a situation? And so the starting observation is really that, relatively speaking, Europe does not feature as centrally in US grand strategy as it used to during, for example, the Cold War. And just to briefly clarify this up front, with grand strategy, I refer to the means-ends chain that prescribes how to best safeguard the national interest. So kind of the grand principle that are going to organize the way a state behaves in the international realm. And my starting observation is that Europe does not feature as centrally in US grand strategy as it used to. If, for instance, we think about the grand strategy under the George W. Bush administration in the 2000s, people tend to think about the war on terror, about Iraq, Afghanistan, but not so much about Europe. In the case of former President Barack Obama, a lot of people would describe him as pursuing a little bit more of a restrained foreign policy, but also a lot of focus on the US rebalance or pivot to Asia. So again, Europe was not the stated priority. Under former President Donald Trump, as well as the current Biden administration, we see a growing preoccupation with China, with Sino-American competition. So again, Europe not being, so to speak, the center of attention. Now, obviously, with the ongoing war in Ukraine, that has blurred the discussion on strategic priorities a little bit, but it's also telling that the Biden administration really continues to underline in many of its communications and in some of the key strategic documents, such as the National Security Strategy and the National Defense Strategy, those documents that have been published after the February 2022 invasion already started, and they all still emphasize that China is the primary focus. They call it the pacing threat for US national security. And so it's kind of with this in mind that my research question was then, well, if we know this, then what explains variation actually in the role of Europe in all of this, in the role of Europe in US grand strategy? And the arguments that I'm developing and I'm trying to build is that, like, yes, this vague notion that most people agree upon, that Europe has been downgraded in US grand strategy, I think that's definitely true. But I also think that there's a logical and underexplored consequence of this downgrade, and that is that the United States has also increasingly started looking and started thinking of Europe not only as a theater in and of itself, but also really as a home to a set of relationships that it can at times instrumentalize in pursuit of extra-European goals. And so this is really where my book comes in, because there's this tendency in the literature on US-Europe relations to always dwell on this question of how much does Europe matter, should the US retrench, yes or no? And I think that rather than debating how much Europe matters, which is a reasonable debate to have, there's another question, and that's the question of how, not how much, but how Europe matters, that's perhaps even more interesting. And so again, the argument here being that there's been a downgrade, but perhaps more importantly, there's been a re-conceptualization. There's this ongoing reconceptualization of the transatlantic relationship from the point of view of the United States. Now, of course, the United States has a long history of seeking European acquiescence or support to its role as the quote-unquote leader of the international system. But during the Cold War, Washington would always seek European support in a grand strategic struggle against a European power. And now we're seeing that this is happening in different extra-European struggles of sorts. So within the war on terror, or when it comes to China. And I think that given that this structural context has changed, we also need to kind of update the theoretical and empirical tools that we use to think about the evolution of this relationship. And so more precisely, I say that, well, if we want to understand how the United States has tried to instrumentalize these relationships, we really need to kind of open up the black box of the United States, and we need to look at the ideas of the US president and his or her, but de facto his most immediate advisors on the viability of transatlantic cooperation in light of the geopolitical pressures at hand. And I'm going to unpack this in the remainder of the presentation. Because grand strategy, as I mentioned, it is supposed to be about applying and distributing resources towards your priorities. And if we accept this definition, then that also implies that we can logically expect US strategy with other, perhaps deprioritized actors and regions like Europe to try to make those serve these grand strategic priorities. And more practically speaking, it's also simply the fact that European countries and institutions and actors have quite some power, at times latent power, but they can also choose to support or undermine what the US is doing elsewhere. So an example here are the recent efforts of the Biden administration to prevent US allies, including countries in Europe like the Netherlands, from selling semiconductors to China, for instance. But scholars have not really systematically addressed this question, and so this is kind of what I try to do, what I try to do in my book. And in doing so, I try to add some nuance to some of these dichotomous arguments that, like, the rise of China is going to lead to the death of the transatlantic relationship on the one hand, or it's really going to reinvigorate the transatlantic relationship on the other hand. I think we're always seeing kind of like an evolution, and I think we always see like a much more nuanced story, and I think that these nuances are very important, especially from a European point of view, which is also where I'm coming from, because European countries remain, albeit to differing degrees, they remain strategically intertwined with the United States, and their relationship with the United States for many European countries is really a key referent, not the only, but a key referent in how they think about their own role in the world. And so that also implies that when the United States is going to shift course, that this will have a big impact on the European side as well. And so to kind of substantiate this argument, I've divided the book project in seven chapters, but what I will do in kind of the next maybe 20-25 minutes or so is talk a little bit about the theoretical backbone of the book, and then to give a snapshot of some of the empirics to underline some of the key takeaways and the added value of this approach, and perhaps also to tease out some of the issues that we can then talk about during the discussion. So first, and this is kind of a lot on this slide, so apologies for that, but I'm going to walk us all through it. So I really use this concept of grand strategy it's not a coincidence that I use this. I really think it's very useful actually for what I'm trying to do. Because as I mentioned, so grand strategy, it's about a means-ends chain that prescribes how to best safeguard a state's national interest. So a grand strategy basically responds to two key questions. A what question, what are a state's primary interests, what are your objectives, what are your ends, and a how question, how are you going to go about achieving those, what combination of means is most appropriate to realize those. And now what distinguishes grand strategy from all of these other levels that I've laid out on this figure is the fact that other strategic means and ends or means-ends chains they generally concern intermediary goals that are not only goals in themselves, but that also serve as means for activities that occur at superior levels of strategy. So what do I mean here is, I have here this figure that's based on the work of Edward Luttwak, in which you see different levels of strategy, and they're all set out hierarchically in reference to the ultimate level of strategy. And at each level, we have kind of a means-ends logic, and within each level, strategists are always going to be tasked with responding to a what question and a how question, but really within a very concrete, defined context. So for instance, at the operational level of strategy, strategists are going to select appropriate combination of means for waging war, and then they can make a choice whether they want to focus more on attrition or maneuver and so on and so forth. Similarly, when we're thinking at the theater level, US strategists, when they're thinking about a theater level strategy for Europe, then they're going to think about really the logic of action and reaction within the geographically delimited theater that is Europe. And it's then finally at the level of grand strategy that actors are going to be pursuing ends that are just pursued for their own sake, so ends that do not serve as a means for anything else, and that's kind of where this notion of the national interest comes into play. Now, of course, even if we have all of this happening at these horizontal levels, it's also true that these levels somehow interact. They do not operate fully autonomously from each other. And this is also why Edward Luttwak speaks also of a vertical dimension of strategy. And indeed, we see that the technical level is supposed to also serve the tactical level. Then also at the level of theater strategy, that's where kind of all the operations come together to kind of then impact the overall balance at the theater level. And then events at the theater level, on their part, they're also conditioned by what's happening at the grand strategic level. And so basically, you also have this vertical logic where all of these things interact. So, and if we think about grand strategy this way, then the notion of integration becomes very important. And so grand strategy in my conceptualization really becomes grand because it's concerned with how US engagements in different regions or different theaters actually serve its global priorities. And so US strategic engagements in a single region or a single theater like Europe, we can consider those both ends as well as means. It just depends on the type of question that you're asking and where kind of you put yourself in this figure. And so when we're speaking of Europe's role in US grand strategy, we can either be interested in the theater level, but what I'm interested in is in how this theater level interacts with this grand strategic level, so with this vertical dimension. Because Europe, of course, has its own, even if it is a contested reality as a geographic entity, the United States recognizes that. We also see that the US national security bureaucracy, the Department of State, Department of Defense, National Security Council, all of these bureaucratic institutions are organized around, in part, around regional bureaus. So that really underlines the fact that regions and theaters matter in US strategic thinking. But of course, different regions like Europe, they do not exist in isolation, and they're also part of a bigger global integrated system. And so that's where this logic of the fact that the United States is also compelled to think about how it can instrumentalize what happens at the theater to serve what it wants at the grand strategic level. And that's why I also argue that when we think about America's European strategy, we can think about Europe as a theater, but we can also think about Europe as a potential partner or competitor and so on and so forth. And it's really this second dimension that I'm interested in for the reasons that I've mentioned, because of this broader downgrade and re-conceptualization. So that being said, what then explains kind of this vertical dimension or variation in this vertical dimension. And to kind of address that question, my argument builds on the logic of neoclassical realism, and it really examines kind of the relationship and the causal relationship between these structural geopolitical pressures, then leaders' ideas, and then eventually Europe's role in US grand strategy, which is my dependent variable, so to speak. And so the kind of contribution that I make here is that I argue that leaders' ideas on this viability of transatlantic cooperation are really crucial to understand how the United States, whether or not it seeks to instrumentalize these relationships, and when it does, how it does. And so just very briefly, I won't get into too much in depth about this. Neoclassical realism is an IR theory. It comes in very kind of forms and variations, but broadly speaking, it's kind of a research approach that explores the internal processes by which states kind of arrive at policies and decide on actions in response to external pressures that emanate from the international environment. And so neoclassical realism's starting point is usually a structural realist baseline, so this proposition that the scope and the ambition of a state's grand strategy is first and foremost driven by its position in the international system. And it's also based on this logic that I accept this notion that there has been a downgrade in the role of Europe in US grand strategy. I take this as a given because there are a series of geopolitical tendencies and developments that have kind of stripped Europeans from their role as kind of the key protagonists in world politics. But of course, the fact, again, that Europe has been downgraded doesn't really tell us that much about what precisely happens in the transatlantic relationship, because it leads to all kinds of questions where Europeans, both individually as well as within the framework of the EU or NATO, were they considered spoilers or competitors or force multipliers in the war on terror? Did they have any role in the rebalance to Asia? What is kind of their role in Sino-American competition? These are the kind of the issues that I want to clarify. And neoclassical realism helps me do that because it explicitly recognizes that kind of the impact of such geopolitical pressures is indirect and complex and conditioned by a whole series of actors and actions at the state level. And so to see how the United States responds to this how question of grand strategy, we need to look at ideas within the state, and we need to look at the strategic ideas that are held by US leaders and their closest advisors. Now, why do I look at leaders specifically? Well, I already mentioned that grand strategy is kind of this place where all these different, potentially contradictory values and operating rules of lower level regional strategies come together because the state has only limited resources, and sometimes you just have competing demands that you need to structure and organize. And it's basically, my argument is basically that it is up to the leader or up to the president to kind of define according to which criteria you are going to organize and you're going to structure these different theater strategies. And it's really up to them to kind of think about this how question of grand strategy by organizing this, because, and why is this up to leaders? Because it's only at the highest level of government and it's only at the level of the president that there can be or that there is an understanding of how all these separate strategies and relations interrelate. And for that reason, it's ultimately, it comes down to the leader, because that's the only place where everything kind of comes together and where you can really have an overview of the entire puzzle. And so in the empirical case that I'm interested in, which is the case of Europe, the question has become, does the US leader consider Europe and different European partners a promising cooperative partner for the United States or not, or rather a competitor? And so cooperation, I have this big explanation and this big discussion about this in the book manuscript, but I'll spare you from that. The bottom line here is that in general, there's this consensus in the literature that if you want to cooperate, you need to give up some of your policy autonomy, because you expect to gain also concrete benefits for that. So the alternative to cooperation tends to be unilateral state behavior. And so when we put all of this together, we basically, in my book, I really examine kind of ideas from these different presidents on the trade-off between cooperation and autonomy when they think about Europe as a means of US grand strategy. And so how do I then kind of apply this logic? I do a structured focus comparison of 3 cases. So the George W. Bush in the early 2000s, then the Obama administration and the Trump administration, because in all 3 cases we see that the priority was not Eurocentric. And in each case, I start kind of by laying out the US's view or the US's perception of kind of its main challenges and of kind of these structural pressures that it was subject to kind of lay out what were like the key goals and what were the key ends. And then, and this is the key variable of interest, then I look at these leader strategic ideas on the viability of transatlantic cooperation, so this autonomy cooperation trade-off. And then I look at what this actually means for Europe and this discussion of Europe. I organize this along 3 dimensions, so I always look at US policies towards the European balance of power. I look at how the US behaves towards Europe on the world stage, and then I look at US policies towards NATO. I've just organized this along these 3 dimensions because it's a lot of empirical material, and this is also just to make sure that in the different case studies that I'm actually looking at the same things and that I'm actually comparing apples to apples and not just to something else. So I'm happy to elaborate on the research design or coding and all of these things if there's an interest, of course, during the Q&A. And so what do I then find? Apologies. Is that when we kind of look at the George W. Bush administration, it seemed that what they were pushing for was very much an obedient Europe that could serve as a subordinate partner to the United States in the war on terror. So when Bush entered office, the notion of unipolarity was really very much in vogue. This was really a time at which the United States felt like there was no peer competitor to be concerned about because its relative power advantage, both economically as well as militarily, was simply deemed completely unmatched. And so instead, for a variety of reasons that I get into the book, the Bush administration was very much concerned with the expansion of US military, well, not only military power, but with the expansion of American power in the Middle East. Now, what did that mean for the role that he thought that Europe could potentially play there, be it constructive or not? What I found is that, and this is perhaps a little bit contradictory, that the Bush administration kind of pursued some sort of what can be called inclusive unilateralism, because it kind of welcomed many of its European partners to kind of support the United States in the war on terror, but it was only to the extent that they agreed to completely comply with what were Washington's preferences. So it was really about joint policy implementation. It was never about joint policy design. And so the interesting thing about the Bush administration is not so much that it wasn't interested in international cooperation, but that it was really convinced that any type of international cooperation could fully kind of coalesce around its own agenda. And so the Bush administration basically denied that there had to be any trade-off between cooperation and autonomy, because it just always wanted to make sure that it was the others that would adapt to the United States and not vice versa. And that's why I kind of use this term of inclusive unilateralism, because this was deemed also by the Bush administration necessary to provide effective leadership and kind of the best way of action, not only for the United States, but actually also for its partners. So it saw this very much as a win-win situation. And if we kind of then apply this logic in the way that it would approach European countries in the war on terror, it would always kind of make sure, again, that Europe's potential worked for and not against the United States. And the Bush administration really tried to kind of help shape European decisions and institutional developments to always make sure that the United States retained a lot of influence over those issues that it deemed important. So it didn't try to block things, and it kind of was like, you guys can do what you want to do, but it was very short to make it was very careful to make sure that the United States would always retain sufficient points of leverage to kind of get its way when it wanted to. And so it basically proposed some sort of a double division of labor. And so on the one hand, between the European Union and NATO, in which the European Union was kind of expected to care about issues such as, to be concerned about issues such as economics, whereas NATO would really kind of be the key security provider. But then within NATO, the Bush administration also pushed for some sort of an arrangement in which the United States would really be in the lead and would kind of take care of more hard security matters, And then anything that it viewed as related to soft security matters, such as post-conflict reconstruction and all these kind of other issues, that it was happy to kind of delegate to the allies. So it really wanted kind of flexible arrangements with these institutions in which the United States could kind of dictate the term. And which is why I talk about Europe as a partner to the United States, but as a partner that the Bush administration wanted to be kind of subordinate and obedient to the United States, kind of mostly calling the shots. This is quite different from the way that the Obama administration went about things, because Obama called for what I call and what others have also called a more post-American Europe that could help enable his rebalancing. And so what do I mean with that? Obama came into office right after the 2008 financial crisis with a rising China, when there was really a lot of talk about the rise of the West. So, he was famously photographed also with a book on the rise of the West when getting on a plane, I believe. And so really Obama had many ambitions, but when it comes to how he would like to allocate his resources between different regions, it was clear that he wanted to prioritize East Asia more. He also wanted to prioritize the domestic more, but also East Asia more as compared to especially the Middle East, but also to Europe. But his views on kind of what role Europe could play in this were quite different. Because what Obama wanted was to kind of enlarge and update what scholars have started calling the liberal international order, to include rising powers and emerging powers. And he kind of wanted all of the world's major powers, both old and new, to kind of come together for the common good. And so under Obama, the United States would very much remain the indispensable nation, but it would not be the indispensable nation because of its unmatched military capability, but it would more be the indispensable nation because of its kind of unique ability to bring partners together and to foster cooperation. So this was kind of the theory behind it. And so trading off some policy autonomy and giving up some autonomy to kind of pursue this cooperation was, according to Obama, the only way to protect what he called our common security and to advance what he called our common humanity. And so Obama viewed international actors as fundamentally rational, and therefore he also argued that he expected that it was in the interest of many of these emerging countries to join the order, because that order had really allowed them to thrive so many years. So this was not about charity, but it was simply, he really thought it was simply in the interest of other actors as well to do so. And so it's quite interesting because from the viewpoint of George W. Bush, it was really an imbalance of power on the part of the United States that was considered kind of the best way to achieve international stability and prosperity and security for the United States, whereas Obama kind of wanted to create more of a multi-partner world in which the United States would share some of this burden of maintaining order with others. So we see then, given this kind of theory of international cooperation, we see also that this translates in a very different approach towards Europe, because what Obama basically wanted was for the United States' European allies to be more united and to be stronger, to some extent under Germany's leadership, even if that is something that's very contested. And he basically wanted Europeans to act as the main security provider in their own immediate neighborhood. Again, this would kind of relieve the United States from some of this burden, and that would allow the United States to focus its resources elsewhere, so be just back at home or elsewhere in East Asia. Obama also really started pushing a lot more for burden sharing within NATO. And interestingly, when it came to some of his flagship initiatives on the global stage, his efforts to maintain global economic stability after the financial crisis, but also his initiatives when it came to non-proliferation, when it came to fighting climate change, and I describe all of these in the book. He always would welcome European support, but he was often more interested seemingly in building relationship with other and emerging powers. So from the point of view of Obama, it was kind of like Europe is not the main source of our problems, but it's not really the main source of our solutions either. And so he really counted on Europeans to be like active participants in the liberal international order, but he was also glad to forsake kind of the transatlantic link in favor of new partnerships with emerging and perhaps more high potential partners for the future. And this kind of created somewhat of a kind of tense there's some sort of a tension here from the viewpoint of many Europeans, because several European actors and institutions very much liked the refusal of Obama to kind of divide the world into friends and enemies as his predecessor had done, and to kind of pursue a more inclusive international order. But of course, a more inclusive international order also implied a relative downgrade of the West as a strategic unit within this order. And so Obama was more willing to give Europeans, he was more willing than Bush to have kind of, so to speak, Europeans run the show, but he was also much less interested in being involved in all of that. If we then go finally to the Donald Trump, to the most recent Donald Trump administration, so when they, again, we see a very different, a quite different approach. So when Donald Trump enters office, the starting observation of his administration is really that the United States' position in the world was fragile, on the path to decline. And by that time, really a slow consensus has started emerging that it would really be the US-China relationship that would be absolutely key to shaping the future of global politics. This theme had been getting attention for several years already, but it's really under the Trump administration that China is put so front and center, and that competition with China, so not just any type of relationship with China, but that competition with China becomes like such a buzzword and becomes really kind of the main theme in Washington. Now, what then could Europe potentially be a partner? What could the role be of Europe in Sino-American competition? Well, Trump and his advisors, they embraced kind of strategic ideas that were very different from the ones from the Obama administration. Obama had always emphasized interdependence, shared responsibilities, whereas the Trump administration really wanted more independence and self-reliance. So the Trump administration really wanted relief from the burdens of global leadership, but they also wanted to maintain kind of this thrill of national self-assertion. So it's about getting more self-reliance and freedom of action instead of cooperation. So Trump himself in particular really did not want the United States to be dependent on any other country, be it an ally or an adversary, because he was of the view that others simply always fail to kind of live up to their commitments, and that the United States was always, quote unquote, being ripped off by others. This also goes back to all of these complaints about allied burden sharing and so on. And so in light of these strategic ideas, so the fact that there's this really preoccupation with China and an emphasis on like self-sufficiency, the fact that it's a dangerous world, which is very different from his two predecessors. We see also that in the way that the Trump administration would approach Europe, the key thing seemed to be that they wanted to make sure that Europeans could not undermine what the United States was doing with respect to China. So it was more about preventing us from being a spoiler than from really seeking to create some sort of a new partnership of sorts. And the general modus operandi was always one in which the Trump administration would threaten negative consequences, be it in trade, be it in security relations, when to coerce kind of other countries into following US preferences. His threats, for instance, to cut intelligence cooperation with European countries if they accepted the Chinese telecommunications provider Huawei from entering to their networks is really a key example here. And so Trump shared Obama's frustration about burden sharing, for instance, within NATO. But in contrast to the Obama administration, he also very much rejected the notion of any sort of strong European pillar with or without the EU in this context, because a stronger kind of unified European bloc would, of course, decrease U.S. leverage over individual allies, and that's something that the Trump administration was not ready to give up. Trump liked to have leverage over individual allies in order to make sure that they wouldn't do anything that he and his administration didn't like. And when it came to some of the allies, for instance, more in Eastern Europe, we kind of see some sort of a quid pro quo emerging in which the Trump administration basically committed to protecting them against Russia if they kind of accommodated their policies when it came to China. So we see a strong dislike on the part of the Trump administration for formats such as the 17+1 that I believe is now again the 16+1, which is kind of like a framework in which China comes together with a bunch of countries to talk about infrastructure investments and all the like. And so it's for that reason that I argue that, like, in an era of Sino-American competition, The Trump administration basically wanted Europe to be relatively weak and relatively inconsequential to allow kind of the Trump administration really to focus on this competition with China, which was much more seen, which was not necessarily seen as something that European countries had a big role to play. And so kind of to bring all of this together, my starting observation is, okay, we seem to kind of agree that Europe has been downgraded in the context of US grand strategy, as subsequent administrations have started prioritizing first the Middle East and then more and more East Asia and China in particular. But that has really compelled US administrations to think increasingly of Europe not only as a theater or a region in and of itself, but also, like I said, as a set of relationships that can be instrumentalized in support of US priorities elsewhere. We see also this under the Biden administration, where we see a clear push from the United States to start discussing China within a NATO context, but we also see this within the context of a whole range of new formats, such as the new, now it's not that new anymore, but the Transatlantic Trade and Technology Council, where we also definitely see that there's kind of like a China vibe over all of this. Now, nonetheless, in spite of these changes, Europeans still very much have, or not all of them, but still kind of have the tendency to view the US-Europe relationship as really a central or the central feature of global geopolitics, and they tend to look at this US-Europe dyad in isolation. But I argue that in order to fully understand what drives US policy, you really need to put this dyad into perspective, and you really need to put this transatlantic relationship within kind of a grand strategic perspective. Now, on the US side as well, the debate on America's European strategy is sometimes, in my view, a little bit too narrow still. We see in a lot of places a big push to adopt a grand strategy of restraint or offshore balancing, and the people who are advocating this argue that, well, the United States can easily partially retrench from Europe because there's no real threat to the balance of power there. Russia is much weaker than the Soviet Union, and so on and so forth. And so they argue that a smaller footprint of the United States in Europe is long overdue. Now, what my book tries to show is that their argument kind of risks underestimating how much leverage the United States actually has over European foreign policy because of its security role in Europe. And I think that this is something that offshore balancers need to kind of grapple with. They may very well conclude that they think that this leverage is not worth it. It's not up to me to take any normative position on this, but I do think that it's important to kind of address this issue a little bit more explicitly, and I hope that my book can also somehow help kind of push that debate forward. And then kind of very finally, there are also like some theoretical implications, but I haven't really spoken about that today, in the sense that my book also tries to bring leaders back into the debates, because I'm always quite surprised that in the lead up to the US elections, people in the United States, people in Europe, were all trying to figure out what to expect in terms of foreign policy, and we're all trying to kind of crack the code. And then a couple of years in, then a lot of people say, well, it's just continuity and it's just same old, same old. And then I think, but then why are we then so interested in this to begin with? So my argument is not at all that leaders are almighty, but I do think that they play a role in kind of shaping, in kind of setting the parameters of the debate and in shaping the debate. And I think that this is also important in the way that we think about democratic accountability and responsibility. But this is something that I'm still kind of figuring out what I want to do with this. So to kind of provide a response to my question, is Europe indispensable or insufferable? Probably a little bit of both, but in the end, you'll have to ask the next US president what he or she thinks about that. So with that, I'll wrap up, and thank you for your attention.
Tom? And to all my colleagues, and if you don't mind introducing yourself.
Sure. I'm Thomas Berg. I'm one of Kaya's colleagues over at the Pardee School, and I've been interested in alliance issues for a very, very long time. So I found your talk very provocative, interesting, and I think kind and important as well. So thank you first for that. I could talk a lot, but I'm going to try to keep a couple narrow points. One, I think it's really, whenever I hear the word grand strategy, I get a little nervous. If you read Hal Brand's and other literature, it's a slippery concept. And one thing And I come from things from a slightly different angle, but I do think it's important you bring in more of the interactive element here. I mean, the US grand strategy is so much shaped by the grand strategy of our European partners. One of the best books I remember reading on the history of the alliances, Geir Lundsted's An Empire by Invitation. But I think it applies, what Lundstedt says, applies not only to the creation of the empire, and you can debate lots of things, I don't agree with everything that he says, but also its maintenance. I mean, the Europeans are constantly looking for ways of tying us in. They've got their own debate. So there's really an interactive game. And this grand strategy of the US, I would say, is really kind of not something that leaders sit and think about it. It's an emergent property, right? Which comes out. And the Europeans, the British in the front, but the Germans, the French, all of them find ways of making themselves useful when they want to. And I think that's an important element. I think also, not only think about the interaction of the alliances, but more about the public. It has to be legitimated. That's part of the grand strategy concept. And the Europeans play a tremendously important role for legitimating, also internally for the US, what we're doing. And then I think, more broadly, I think this emphasis on personality and bringing leaders back in, I think that's really important. I think you answer a lot of things. That you can get at a lot of important things, but there's this thing in Washington called the blob, sometimes called the defense community, and it has a real impact. I think there's a lot more continuity in U.S. grand strategy and the underlying instincts, the DNA that seems to guide it, and you yourself recognize it. As you say, we always seem to wind up with the same old thing. And here again, by the way, when you take a look, and the historian will tell you, there's a real difference between Bush 1 and Bush 2, right? I mean, and you can say it's the learning process as he interacts with, right, both the Europeans and with the blob. He winds up having to shift. It's pretty clear also, not so clear, much clearer with Obama with regard to Europe, but much more clear in terms of Obama vis-a-vis Asia. I mean, Obama came in saying he's going to be the first Asian president, president of the United States. He lived in Indonesia, grew up in Hawaii, so he had this whole biographical thing. And he came in thinking we're going to create something like a G2 with China. Boy, was he ever surprised. Right? I mean, after the Sunny, with too much detail. Trump, we never got to that point. The man could never be taught or learn anything. But his own advisors, many of them, beginning with General Mattis, Tillerson, Pottinger, Dan Coates, the DNI, I mean, they had very different ideas, and they were quietly trying to nudge the system in a different direction. And in concrete ways, they actually succeeded, so that Europe, including in European policy. So I think you'd get a lot of pushback from historians. I think if you complexified your model and you went beyond a little bit of this sort of, I mean, the way it was presented here was a little bit very interesting, but a little bit mechanical. By the way, Ed Blutwack, I had to smile. He's such a crazy character. I don't know if I've ever interacted with him. Yeah, well, I mean, his book, Grand Strategy of the Roman Empire, is great, and so on, but he's kind of viewed as a nutcase. So I would use somebody else as my lead in as the introduction strategy. So that's enough for me. Sorry to go on. And yes, I agree with you. They're neither insufferable, you're absolutely right, they're neither indispensable nor insufferable, they're both. And above all, they're unavoidable. There's no way to have
That's a good adjective to add. I'm going to write that down.
Yeah, no, I mean, I like that title. It's a great title. But I think the truth of the matter is you can't do a U.S. grand strategy without Europe. And even if Europe declines, I mean, I remember I was in Germany, I was asked multiple times when I was doing the pivot to Asia, what does this all mean? So I understand all these anxieties. I also deal with Japan. And Japan is, a shadow of what it once was, but it's actually even more important than ever in U.S. grand strategy. And I think the same is true of Europe. That is, as we move towards a more competitive situation and where we have a multipolar world, any element that gives us leverage becomes more important. So I think Europe is, to reassure your European, I think they're going to be more important than ever. Sorry to go on so long.
If you'd like to respond,
thank you. A lot of great points, and some of the issues that you mentioned, I get at them in the book. Not all of them, so I really appreciate you pointing them out. But it's always also kind of a struggle how much can you cram into like a 40-minute presentation. The point you make about the interactive element, of course, that strategy is something interactive. It's not just something that one day you come up with an idea and you decide to implement it. I definitely agree with that, and I actually think that it's a difficult thing to deal with, and I actually think it's a weakness in a lot of the literature on strategy and grand strategy in general, but also weakness in my own research. Now, the way that I kind of approach this in the book is that I also very much say I consider grand strategy to be something intentional, and I'm interested in what the United States wants and what the United States tries to do, and kind of the resource allocation decisions that it makes based on those decisions. So I'm interested in US outputs, which are very different from outcomes, because once you get to outcomes, it's also like the reaction of like events happen and how perhaps European partners might kind of respond to this, which is something very different, because we also see at times that, like, yes, Obama wants Europeans to do this and Bush wants Europeans to do that, but sometimes, well, we don't, right? So I try to kind of come at this by saying I'm really looking at this from the viewpoint of what the United States wants, which is not necessarily what it gets, but which is perhaps a distinction that I should be a little bit more clear about. The point you also make about it being an emergent property and adaptation along the process. Again, I think it's an excellent point and a very valid remark. It is my view that a lot of you see some learning, you see some adaptation. There's a big debate on like whether ideas are sticky and whether leaders really learn and so on and so forth. But it does seem to be that most of the adaptation tends to occur, I would say, at kind of the lower levels of the strategic kind of hierarchy that I put out, and that we don't see any leader fundamentally altering kind of their worldview. So we see like tinkering in the margins, but I think it's fair to say if you stay at like a relatively high level of abstraction, then of course you can fit more things into the bucket. But there definitely occurs some adaptation at some of the lower levels when it comes to the implementation. Your point about kind of legitimacy and the relevance of the public, again, I think it's an excellent point, but I do think that the notion that legitimacy is very important for what the legitimacy that can be kind of granted to what the United States does by getting perhaps support from others in the world, not every president cares about that. That's also a choice whether or not you care about that. And when it comes to legitimacy, I don't think that the Trump administration was very concerned with any type of legitimacy that it would get from working with others. It did work with others, right? But I don't think that legitimacy was kind of like a key thing. The way that the Obama administration thought about legitimacy and the way that the Bush administration thought about legitimacy, also very different. So I think it's a factor to take into account, but how important perhaps European support is for that, I think it kind of depends also on the orientation of the specific administration that is in office. Now, with the Biden administration, we indeed kind of see very much this argument, but it's an argument that's not like steadily across administrations, I think. Our point about the blob, of course. So of course, and in the book, I mean, I personally don't really like the term of the blob because I think it throws a whole bunch of actors into the same basket. But of course, there is the bureaucracy, there is all kinds of domestic interest groups and all of that. And in the book, I also say a little bit that indeed we have all these forces of continuity. And there's also a lot of neoclassical realist research actually on these forces of continuity. But what I'm interested in is can the president be a force of change in spite of all these forces of continuity? So I'm not saying that he has the ability to fully overcome this, but given kind of the parameters within one is operating, because also not everybody can just be a US president. There's kind of certain ideas and certain propositions that are simply completely unthinkable. So you are operating within kind of some parameters, but what I'm trying to say is that even within these parameters, we actually still see some variation, and we actually still see that there is some room of maneuver. And what one considers to be change, it's always a difficult question, because a lot of the literature on US grand strategy, for instance, a lot of people make these typologies, offshore balancing, deep engagement, but of course if you make a typology, then the benchmark for defining change is very high because you would have to go to a completely different type. So a lot of it depends on like, what do you consider to be change? And I've discussed this research with others, and mostly on the American side, people will say it's all continuity. But on the European side, this is not how it is experienced, right? And so it depends on what degree of change you consider to be kind of a relevant for you. Just to give a concrete example, when it comes to support for the European integration process, it's very different under Bush, Obama, and Trump. Very different. Some of the things are, of course, the same. The United States likes to have influence over Europe, but the way they go about this, Bush was all about supporting European enlargement. The Trump administration was like, no, the EU, it's just a vehicle of German power. So these are perhaps small nuances, but I do think they matter, especially like in the eye of on the receiving end. Yes. And then perhaps, so I wrote down your point about the Trump administration, and of course the infighting within the kind. I feel that you kind of alluded also to the adults in the room, and the fact that Trump himself might have had like some views that were a little bit different from some of the people around him. This is also something that I've had to grapple with quite a bit, although I would actually argue that in the Bush 43 there was actually also quite some debate within. I mean, it was like perhaps a different style, but it was not as if they were all kind of fully on the same page either at that time. And so the way I go about this is kind of to select the ideas. So I base there a lot on the work of Elizabeth Saunders to one extent, but I really select these ideas based on 3 criteria. So duration, specificity, and concordance. And so with duration, I already start looking at all kinds of interviews and things that people have said like before they become the president and throughout the period of time to really select those ideas that have remained like rather constant. That also is kind of a way to protect against this notion that, oh, maybe leaders say things that they don't mean. I'm sure that leaders sometimes lie. I'm sure that they sometimes say things that they don't mean, but if you're going to look at like a whole like many years of what they were saying, you can kind of tease out like the recurring themes. Specificity, another one. So the idea has to be like specific enough, and people kind of have to understand what this means to be able to decide whether they support it or not. But then thirdly, so concordance, and perhaps I'm not pronouncing this word correctly because I find it a little bit of a strange word, meaning that I also select the ideas for which there is like within kind of the White House kind of a consensus. So the ideas that they agree upon, because you can logically expect those to kind of gain more traction and have more influence and see those better translated than the ones that are very controversial. And so I think we speak a lot about the adults in the room in the Trump administration, but it is really my analysis that for a lot of things, Donald Trump really got what he wanted. And for a lot of things, with the exception of the vice president, if you really don't like the other people, you can basically fire them and find somebody else. And this is also something that we saw very much in the Trump administration. So it's my analysis that he was very much not on everything. There were like some complex files, the Russia file being one especially. But he was, in my view, very much running the show. And some of the kind of key things, the world is a dangerous place, the United States needs to be as self-reliant as possible, we can't have our allies rip us off. I do think that those were kind of views that were relatively widely shared within the administration nonetheless. And so by kind of adopting these 3 criteria in the way that I'm going to measure these ideas, which is of course always something difficult, I try to kind of make sure that I'm really capturing those that we can really expect to have influence, because the point that you make about kind of some of the turnover and the, I don't know if I can call it chaos, but at least kind of like the unusual way that some things happened in the Trump administration is definitely something that I've grappled with a lot.
Chaos is good. Chaos is good.
Chaos works, yeah. Linde, I don't usually jump the line, but I'm going to ask my question because I think my question might be clarifying, because I want to state back to you what I think that your main argument is, and see if I understood that correctly. So that might help other people in their questions. So I had a similar reaction to Tom at a couple moments in your presentation when I felt uncomfortable, like you were essentializing individuals, had similar thought processes, like, but what about this, but what about that? Thinking about outcomes that a president's not involved in, and being like momentarily frustrated by that. But then I thought about the bigger picture. I think what you're saying is that I actually like what you. I'm just going to interrupt myself really quickly. I like what you said to Tom when you said there's an assumption, like an institutional assumption. You can call it the blob, you can call it institutionalism or stickiness of continuity, right? In U.S. foreign policy at the grand strategic level. However, it's experienced by others as change. And so I like that puzzle a lot for a framing device for the beginning of your work, because I like puzzles, but also because it immediately makes sense to me, what you're saying. And so then you're saying that under what conditions does a president matter? And at what level of strategy? And so I don't know if you fully answered that, under what conditions, but at what level, I think, is what you're harnessing. You're saying that presidents can't turn the ship around because these are institutions, they're democracies, there's so many advisors, there's so much interagency process, you know what I mean? These are very big, sticky institutions where things don't happen. However, at the grand strategic level, the playground for a president is what a theater is. I think that's what you're saying. And so to me that's really interesting, and if I'm getting it right, it's also a theory building opportunity because it connects to other work out there. That one of the best things that's ever been written that was really shocking at the time, but is one of the only things that makes sense about the Iraq War, is Ahsan Butt's security studies piece, where he says that the Bush administration went to war in Iraq as a demonstration effect to other rising states like China because it felt embarrassed about military failures in the 90s. And that was, it was electrifyingly shocking when it came out. But you are making this argument explicit that there is a playground at the theater level where sometimes the theater is the target and sometimes the theater is the demonstration or the aggregator or indirect. So am I getting that right?
Yes.
Okay.
So it's not entirely how I would say it, but I think it's an interesting way because I'm also still wrapping my head around how I want to say it. Kind of as a playground or as kind of like a performative thing.
Or it's real. It's quite real. Like the president. What you're showing, variation-wise, an inference is that the president can manipulate that level of grand strategy because the president, is shepherding the National Security Council, and that there are reasons why that
I think the point about the
works.
president is that I really have the impression the cult of inevitability is so strong in a lot of the literature on be it US strategy or European strategy. They're always going to do this, they're always going to do that. But then I also wonder, then why do we even bother kind of researching it? And so I wanted to kind of push back against that because indeed, as you mentioned, the way it is experienced can sometimes be perhaps very different. And I do think that the experience on the European side has definitely been an experience of variation. And one can debate to what extent some of these initiatives were sustainable long-term, were they really as impactful as one might have thought at the time. But perhaps the distinction between the institutional assumption and the experience, I think it's an interesting point you pointed at. So thank you for that.
Thank you for that. Yeah. And thank you for letting me clarify.
I have a question, but I'd like to let graduate students ask any if they have some. You guys want to jump in?
Sure. Yeah. Been really enjoying this conversation on leaders and institutions and how they matter to me. Oh, I'm sorry. Sam Gersel. I'm a second year PhD student here in political science. So I was actually going to ask about how you measure ideas. I think it's a really interesting question. But I guess to follow up on your answer, I'd be really curious about how you distinguish between leaders' ideas and the actual strategic outputs. So I think like a leader might have an idea about the utility of an ally in a certain area. And then how is that distinguished from the decision of how, for instance, France could fit into its strategy?
So I'm not entirely sure if I understand the second part of your question. I'll already respond to the first part, and I'm happy if you can perhaps rephrase it afterwards. Just maybe it's just me, but I'm not entirely sure. Because to make the distinction between so the overall question for measuring ideas, I really looked a lot into the work of Elizabeth Saunders and leaders at war and transformational effects in leaders and so on and so forth, because and there's also I think an HDIPLO roundtable where people go a lot into this. So her work was a very important starting point for me for addressing this very question. How to make a distinction? I really try to make a distinction between what happens kind of at the rhetorical level. So I looked at all of the books that these people have written, but also their campaign books and the strategic documents and all of this, and then kind of more at national security strategy, national defense strategy. In the case of Bush, I think the name of the book is A Compassionate Conservative, and all of the campaign speeches and all of these kinds of things, and also what some of the people that he was working with had written before. And then to look at the actual policy to kind of see, okay, now we decide to put 3 tanks in Europe, to put it very bluntly, right? I think it's just, to some extent you're right. At some point you have to make a distinction. Where do you distinguish rhetoric from action? But I think in practice it's not that hard to kind of do that in my experience. I don't know if that answers your question, and also the second part of your question.
Yeah, I think it does. I guess the leader's ideas seem very similar to what the intervening variable seems very similar to the dependent variable, and that a leader's idea of I think you answered the question pretty well. Thank you.
Any other graduate students? Then we'll get back to our genuinely. Great.
Sure.
Florian.
Florian, 5th year PhD candidate in political science. 2 quick questions. So how do these leaders vary in their conceptualization of what Europe is and what valuable allies are in that context? Because to me it kind of seems that Bush 2, there's some more valuable states to him. I can't remember the specific term. I'm German, so I should know what he called the non-helpful states.
Old and New Europe.
Old and New Europe, right? Yeah. So I'm part of Old Europe, I guess. So how does that vary over time? Because it seems that they're an impact then kind of the role of Europe in grand strategy. Some states matter more, some states matter less in certain times, as do institutions clearly. And then because grand strategy, I always view this as something that is over the long run, right? That it's the next 4 years, 8 years, 10 years, 20 years down the line. Is there any reflection at all in these administrations on how they view the transatlantic alliance and how they operationalize their relationship with these states impacting future grand strategy? In the sense that, yes, right now for immediate payoff, I can leverage Poland and the Baltic states to do what I want, right? But at the same time, I'm also, engaging in, a trade war or whatever you want to call it, a struggle with the European Union, right? So that clearly, puts pressure on those states to maybe move away, right? Or is there just kind of hey, we're using them now because we have them and we'll see what happens in the future kind of reflection? I guess specifically more for the Trump administration than the other two.
So what is Europe is always the excellent question when I present this work. And usually if you present this for a European audience, they're going to get all into the European Union, the European institutions, NATO. But so the way that because you already alluded to it, what is considered an important country or an important institution kind of really depends on what you're trying to do. And so I have this section in the book where I kind of say okay, what is Europe is of course something contested. But then I build a little bit on this work of mental maps, and I say that I'm interested in what is Europe as perceived from the United States, the extent to which different different U.S. Administrations might indeed be more interested in developing relationships with certain parts of the geographic entity as opposed to other parts. And what the U.S. administration thinks about this, again, that does not necessarily have to reflect reality again as it is experienced on the other side. But I think your point about the old Europe, new Europe division in the Bush administration. I mean, definitely we see that by the second term, people say, oh, Bush has changed so much and so on and so forth. But I also like to perhaps push back a little bit on that, because it is true that all of a sudden, I mean, that not all of a sudden, that the Bush administration tries to I believe the phrase is punish Germany, ignore Russia, and forgive France, right? Exactly, thank you. Punish Germany, ignore Russia, and forgive France is kind of the famous phrase of how they kind of went about it in the second term. But I also think that that's true. There was perhaps a little bit of a learning effect, but what the Bush administration was doing in the second term was also very different, because by then it was clear that some of the actions that it had undertaken in Afghanistan and Iraq were perhaps not going as quickly and as swiftly as was initially expected. And so all of a sudden, there's this need for post-conflict reconstruction, post-conflict stabilization, all these kinds of things that they hadn't really thought about upfront that much. And so all of a sudden, these partners that they considered before were perhaps not that important. Well, actually, they might be important after all for these things that we now have to do that we didn't really know. So it was still not as if all of a sudden, sure, the Bush administration tried to have better relations with old Europe, because it actually had not bad relations with new Europe, to the extent that we can use this distinction. But a lot of it had to do also with the way that it kind of miscalculated some of the things, and now all of a sudden had to kind of patch things up to the extent possible. But it was still not interested in these countries to really take on any kind of hard power, high intensity conflict role. It wanted these to do stuff that the United States was itself not very interested in doing, kind of. That's how I don't know if that kind of responds to your question. Your question about the difference between short-term and long-term, I mean, a lot of that it's in the eye of the beholder, whether you think it is a useful investment to try to build some sort of a long-standing relationship, or whether not. And I think that in the case of the Trump administration, we see a little bit of both. But we also see very much this concern with, we can't really trust our allies. They're always ripping us off. So then why would we really invest in this relationship, really deeply, if we're kind of torn on just how useful they are? So I think we see a little bit of both in the Trump administration when it comes to short-term or long-term. But the way you think about these issues, again, I think it goes back to the broader ideas that you just may have about such very wide and heavy topics such as trust in international relations, and whether something such as NATO, a lot of many people in the United States tend to describe NATO as something very an intrinsic interest almost of the United States. Whereas people who are more skeptical, people who are a little bit more in the offshore balancing, they say, no, we need to kind of view alliances as much more of something that's transactional. And if we don't think that there's much in it for us, then why are we investing in it? So this is a tension that you always see in every administration, but I think from a social science perspective, a lot of these things just happened on steroids in the Trump administration. But it's not this tension was not there with other administrations.
So I'm going to take the two questions that I saw. So Kathy.
Okay. So okay. So I wanted to say, first of all, this is super interesting. I'm Kathy Martin. I don't work on security. I work on domestic issues. And in the areas I know something about, there's quite a bit of recycling of ideas and strategies across time. And I've been looking at kind of longer-term cultural narratives in my own work. And so I wondered if you were to boil down the continuities in the grand strategies across administrations, or if there are some kind of enduring cultural tropes in imagining security relations with Europe what might those be? So that's my first question. So you've been talking about the differences, and I'm asking you to refocus a little bit on the continuities. And then the second question is how much of the shift between these presidents has to do with paradigm shifts that resonate in other parts of the world as well. So are there similar kinds of transformations within countries in terms of their foreign policy objectives, and do they just happen on parallel tracks, different but sort of parallel tracks? So did 9/11 inspire similar reactions across the EU as the reactions in America? How much of the kind of Obama's response had to do with the global financial crisis, and did you see similar kinds of movements afoot in Europe?
So Linde, those are two excellent questions, but because of time, I'm just going to take one more and then I'll allow you to.
Sorry, I have a tendency of getting
No,
carried
it's okay.
away.
I just want to make sure that we get to the questions that I did see. And,
Okay.
yeah.
Well, my question is very different. I'm sort of like a 50-year graduate student, right? So, I was involved in foreign policy since the Vietnam peace movement, right, in the 60s, so long time. But I want to get back to first principles if we can, at least a bit, and it's a long discussion. I always like to get back to first principles, which is, why do we have a foreign policy? If you're going to try to educate people in this book other than other, quote, experts, I think we need to always go back and say, why do we need a foreign policy? What has U.S. foreign policy typically tried to achieve? There's all this sort of, your discussion, which I think was excellent, by the way. It's a fabulous talk, but all these kinds of talks are in the superstructure of the high principles, abstract principles of foreign policy. But what is it all trying to accomplish is always my concern. Like I remember once reading an essay which said the State Department shouldn't be called the State Department, it should be the Sales Department for U.S. corporations, okay, to a considerable extent. And your talk too, I'm afraid was a little too abstract, like here's all this foreign policy stuff going on, and in the real world, there's the economy going on, there's corporate competition. Now, of course, we have, quote, a new Cold War with China. As far as I can see, China hasn't done anything wrong, but they're competing in computer chips or other technologies. I mean, why do we want to call that a Cold War? So I would like to see if you can sort of root your ideas more in what's going on in the real world, not just the foreign policy debates. You know what I mean? I mean, does that make sense?
Right.
Why do we have foreign policy?
Great. So what are the other industrial competition kinds of motives? So you have a few
I'll
questions.
respond in the other direction. So the overarching question of why do we need a foreign policy? I think it's an excellent question, and I'm going to really disappoint you with my answer, because in my book I say, well, there's this general assumption that the United States tries to maximize power and security and prosperity, and I'm just going to take that as a given. So I completely bracket that in my book for the reasons that you also alluded to, that people are always very much talking much more about the why than about the what. Why? I mean, how should we do this, and not so much about what are kind of the ends that we're trying to pursue here. Because I think you really point out you make an excellent point in saying what is kind of the end goal, for instance, also with China, right? And these type of things, I have to admit that happy to have a conversation about this afterwards. But I really also bracket this from the discussion because, for the reasons you mentioned, because I say that's actually much less debated than all of the other issues, and I can only do so many things in one book. So I kind of took it as a given. But I appreciate you bringing it up, because I do think it's important to kind of do that reflection perhaps a little bit more.
We actually are over time.
Yeah.
So I would like to be, sorry to interrupt, but I have to manage the time clock.
So I'll be very quickly. I think your question about the continuities and the enduring tropes, I think it's a fascinating question, but I actually would have to think about that a little bit more, because people are always asking me for differences and very rarely for continuities. So I really actually appreciate you pointing that out, and there's a lot maybe at the kind of platitude level. Deep in the United States always wants to maintain like a good relationship with Europe because it wants to export to Europe, and it also wants to make sure that there's no single power that dominates the balance of power in Europe. So there's like these overarching, very, very broad themes, but they are kind of so broad that it doesn't really mean that much. So to have like a little bit more of a concrete idea, I would have to think about that a little bit more, but I appreciate you pointing it out because I've been so focused on the differences. The point you make about paradigm shifts, president's ideas, I think it's a super interesting point, and I've been struggling a little bit always with what is the relationship between kind of structure and ideas, like how much do those co-vary? I think this is a very fundamental question for a lot of work in IR and in social sciences more particularly. I was reading a book the other day also where the Trump phenomenon is very much put into perspective as part of this broader populist wave and so on and so forth. So we definitely see that there's a link between structure and the president's ideas. What precisely this is, I'm not quite sure, and I don't think anybody has really come up with like a perfect solution, but it's something to be aware of, that there's some sort of a co-variation. But in spite of the co-variation, we still see, for instance, that different leaders might still respond very differently, right? Both Obama and Trump are kind of, oh, now the United States has less relative power than before. Obama's solution is like, oh, we have less power, so we need to work more together. Trump says we have less power, so we really don't have to work more together because we're going to have to make compromises, and we can't afford compromises anymore. So there's covariation, but not absolutes. Because the examples that you highlighted of the reactions to 9/11, the reactions to the global financial crisis, again, we see, yes, the overall frame of the war on terror is a little bit adopted in Europe, and there's quite some cooperation. However, in the United States, the war on terror is much more seen as a military problem, a problem of rogue states, a problem of terrorists. And in the European Union, it's much more deemed an issue of internal security. And so the kind of tools that are used it's much more a policing issue. It's much more a justice and, like in Europe, in the EU, this would be justice and home affairs, much more that kind of issue. So the framing is still different, and the policy tools that are going to happen are still different. Same with the global financial crisis. Obama also in his memoirs, he's very frustrated because he says, I keep telling Merkel and Macron, the then presidents of Germany and France, I keep telling them to do kind of this, but with their austerity, what are these Europeans doing? So we definitely see kind of like a different approach there. But within kind of an overarching like paradigm, of course, but still differences in the way that the problem is more precisely framed, and then in the way that the solutions and tools might be kind of mobilized to address that. And of course, we shouldn't overestimate the fact that like Europe, yes, there is some sort of a consensus, but there's also a lot of disagreement on how to go about all of these things, of course. So, yeah, great points. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you.